Standing at the edge of the busy market, sweat pouring down his brow, Chijioko Keke, whom all called CJ, wasn't thinking about food. The air around him was filled with the alluring scent of fried AKALA and ripe plantains, but his greed for food wasn't a thought on his mind. His younger brother, Yukena, tightened his grip on his hand, glancing nervously at the shouting traders surrounding them and the rumbling Danfo buses. Somewhere behind them, their sister Adiz was in heated discussion with a shopkeeper over a bag of rice, her voice steady and firm in spite of their meager budget. Such was the reality of the present, an everyday fight for the family to keep together. It had not always been this kind, though. Just half a year ago, they had been somewhat a normal family. Their father was a lovely but reticent man who hated crossword puzzles. He worked as a clerk in the local government office. Their mother, with the most beautiful laughter, ran a small shop for tailoring. But a rainy evening changed everything for the worse. A car slipped off the drenched road and plowed into their parents, leaving CJ with the responsibility of burying his siblings. At 16, he was everything: brother, father, protector. He had stopped going to school. It was not a case of his dropping out. There was really no other way. Who else was going to pay rent or buy food? He did odd jobs such as washing cars, carrying crates, or cleaning shops, anything to put naira into his pocket. Most of the nights, he hardly slept. But when Yukena looked up at him with those big trusting eyes, it was not a choice. It was the sense of duty. He had felt bad this day. He lost one of his jobs through a delivery error. The shop owner had yelled at him in front of customers and pushed him out. But he did not tell Adiz or Yukena about it because they had enough of their own troubles. At 12 years, Adiz acted older than her years, helping out at home and making sure Yukena did his homework. CJ did not want to burden her further. The problem started when CJ got the job of cleaning Tunde Balagan's office. Tunde was not the kind of man one could say no to. He was loud, dressed in fancy agbadas, and carried himself as if he owned the whole town. Some insinuated that he did, in a way. His name was mentioned in connection with shady undertakings, missing funds, and all sorts of troubles that tended to ruin people. But when CJ had been approached with the job, he could not afford to be asking too many questions. Pay was good, and that was what mattered. For a couple of weeks, the work went smoothly. CJ would run the mop on floors and empty bins without being subjected to Tunde's piercing glare. And then, one morning, hell broke loose. CJ was sweeping when Tunde stormed in like he owned the place. He shouted like thunder, accusing CJ of having stolen quite a bag of money from his desk. The staff froze. CJ's heart raced, out of rhythm and loud enough to drown out every other sound. He stammered a protest, trying to explain that he had touched nothing but the broom. Tunde wasn't paying attention. Minutes later, CJ was dragged to the police station. Yukena cried when the officers shoved CJ into the car. Adiz was running behind, screaming that her brother was innocent. Her voice broke, but the agents paid her no mind. The neighbors gathered to see what was happening, whispering amongst themselves. Some shook their heads, others shrugged. Anyone who lived in this town knew that when someone like Tunde pointed, they didn't argue. Sitting in the cold, filthy cell, an ugly venom of hopelessness began to seep in. He thought about Yukena and Adiz in their dark apartment. Who would make Yukena eat? Who would console Adiz when she cried? The burden resting on his shoulders became heavier by the hour. Another ray of hope appeared in the morning. Inspector Ifini Ease was a tall man with wearied eyes that could always read the news. He had a fair reputation around, although mouths would say he was restrained by the corrupt system. He tossed his eyes, if only briefly, over CJ and onto the flimsy evidence spread on a desk: no fingerprints, no witnesses, only Tunde's statement. Something did not sit right with him. "Are you saying this boy robbed you?" was Inspector Ifini's question to Tunde when he came to give his witness statement. His face stern. Tunde nodded. I saw him myself. He lurked around my office that day. Who else could it be? Still, Ifini wasn't convinced. Something felt off about this case. He had dealt with Tunde in the past but never on a direct basis. Tunde had a special way of making problems disappear, but he could not ignore the quiet boy in the cell. He didn't appear to be a thief, rather that of a desperate man weighed down by too much on his back. Adiz, at home, was not sitting idle. She marched to the police station, demanding to see her brother. When the officers tried to laugh it off, she didn't budge. Finally, when she saw CJ, she assured him that it would all be okay. Her words were firm, but her eyes were watering. CJ could only nod back at her, not having the heart to say he wasn't sure anymore. But Tunde had not yet finished. He ensured people in the marketplace knew the thief who worked for him. They had dragged CJ's name in the mud. The odd jobs he relied on ceased. Ukena came home one day nursing bruises on his arm, afraid to say what had happened. Adiz overheard neighbors talking about them in odd, hushed tones, calling them the cursed family. But CJ would not give up. There was no telling how he would prove himself innocent. Still, he had to try. If he didn't, then who would? Sitting in the cell, he thought over his father's mantra, when the road gets tough, keep walking. One step at a time. CJ did not know how tortuous the road ahead would be, but he settled on one thing: not to let Tunde win. Not while his siblings depended on him. His heart ached for them, as there was little he could do to alleviate their sufferings. He had done nothing to deserve this cruel fate. Tunde made sure of that. So he sat in silence. The place echoed with the whisper of feet and the clang of metal. The first test was on the heels of his arrest. Inspector Ifini had CJ recount everything, every job he did and every point where he went in Tunde's office. CJ stuck to the fact, but the inspector's face was all blank. Afterwards, CJ overheard two officers conversing outside the cell. They were saying that Ifini was under pressure to wrap the case up quickly. Tunde wanted CJ out of the way, and Ifini could have done little to prevent him. This night, CJ couldn't sleep. In his mind, he kept picturing the scene of his arrest, hoping that some point might be there he had skipped. That was when he suddenly remembered the safe. Tunde had a small safe hidden under his desk. CJ had seen it sweepingly only once. If the money had been stolen, wouldn't they have had to break into the safe? But when he mentioned that to the inspector, Ifini merely nodded. CJ could sense his uncertainty. Life was getting a lot harder for his siblings. Adiz kept it up as best she could, cooking, cleaning, and making sure Ukena went to school. The neighbors were very unkind. They would whisper to each other whenever Adiz walked past and warn their children to keep their distance from Ukena. He was bullied at school. "Your brother is a thief," one boy scoffed. Ukena made no effort to hit back. He returned home teary-eyed and refused to say anything about it. Adiz didn't let him see her weak. She wrote letters to anyone who would listen, local leaders, churches, even journalists. Most never replied, but one day a little piece of note came back. It was from a lawyer who saw some chances of helping. She had a problem though, a matter of money. Adiz didn't possess any, and CJ's case needed evidence, not merely ink on paper. Amaka, CJ's friend, would not give up. Every day, she went to the market and asked questions about Tunde. Most vendors were too afraid to even respond. However, she finally found a woman who used to work with him. The woman, Mama Bisi, told her some weird stories she'd heard at the office, one of strange men that always came in late at night with bags, of Tunde raising his voice while phoning someone, and of rumors about missing money. Amaka penned all that down and took it to Inspector Ifini. Ifini went through the notes carefully. He didn't say much, but CJ could see him becoming a visitor of Tunde's office almost daily. One evening, A summons from Ifini came for Tunde. It was a small victory, but Tunde seemed undeterred. As he left the station, he bade CJ a sinister farewell through the bars. "You'll rot in here," were his quiet words. CJ clenched his fists but chose to remain silent. He wouldn't allow Tunde the satisfaction of a reaction. The second trial confronted Amaka, as Tunde's men began to harass her. One day she had a close shave with trouble while on her way home. She was confronted by two men in an alley who warned her against making inquiries. Fear gripped her for a moment, but she did not relent. She told CJ about it at the station during her next visit. "I'm not afraid of them," she spoke with courage. CJ admired her for this, but he was at the same time worried. He didn't want anyone else to come to harm because of him. In spite of the danger, Amaka continued her inquiries. She found an old janitor who had formerly worked for Tunde. The man, Baba Ali, alleged that he was fired after witnessing Tunde and his men counting piles of cash very late one night. Amaka was able to persuade Baba Ali to talk with Ifini, but when the hour came, Baba Ali did not show up. Later, Amaka learned that Tunde paid him off. Hope drained from CJ. You never moved forward without taking 2 steps backward. The third test was the hardest. CJ had begun to notice something strange happening around the station. One morning, he was jolted from his sleep and found that his cell had been ransacked. His meager belongings had been strewn all over the floor, and a piece of paper on which he had been jotting down ideas had vanished. He told Ifini, but the inspector dismissed it as a prank by some troublesome inmates. CJ wasn't so sure. He felt that someone was trying to break him, to bring him down. But he was not alone. Adiz made a point of visiting him whenever she could get around to it. She brought something small to eat, from which he could tell she must not have had much to spare. Ukena came too, but he was quiet. He just sat with CJ, holding his hand. These visits made CJ remember why he could not give up. He had to keep fighting, for their sake. The turning point came when Amaka stumbled upon an old ledger in Tunde's office. She had snuck in one evening while helping another staff member. The ledger was filled with strange transactions, large sums of money that didn't make sense. Amaka brought it to Ifini, who immediately recognized its importance. There was, however, one factual concern in the ledger. Amaka suggested that they acquire more information. One night as he lay awake in his cell, CJ strained to relive his father's words. "When the road gets rough, just keep walking." He realized he couldn't rely on others to unravel this for him. He had to take a risk. With his next meeting with Ifini, CJ asked if he could confront Tunde directly. The inspector hesitated but agreed. The meeting was tense and animating in nature. CJ and Tunde faced each other. Tunde's calm face was an indication that he was somehow burning with fury. Even though CJ had little use for direct accusation, he did put questions out. "What reason would I have for stealing from you? For what would I use such amount?" Tunde avoided giving any answer, instead kept up with comments like, "Thieves always deny." Nevertheless, make no mistake, CJ had been observing. He had noticed the finger tremble at the moment the ledger was mentioned. He had seen Tunde's face betray that momentary flicker of fear. It couldn't be much, but to CJ's mind, it was a point of encouragement. For the first time, he dared to entertain the possibility of a chance. The meeting afterward showed an even greater determination with Ifini. He was asking hard questions this time, not just to CJ, but to Tunde and his staff. Amaka continued the digging as Adiz kept piling on the letters. Slowly, as mice sift a kitchen floor for every crumb left by careless eaters, the truth surfaced. CJ could see a light at the end of the tunnel, although he wasn't out of the woods. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to entertain the idea that this thing might actually pan out for them. The day of the town hall quickly arrived. CJ had some doubts about what to expect, but one thing was for certain: this was his last chance. An open square offered the venue for the community. Plastic chairs set out on a double dozen to hold the canopy. People were whispering among themselves as he was led in by Inspector Ifini. He could feel their gaze. It was dense, a judgment that loomed on him. Adiz and Ukenna sat in the front row, their faces stern. Amaka was further back, a file clutched tightly to her chest. This was it. Their hopes would, henceforth, crash into one another. Tunde Balogun entered with his usual panache. His agbada swayed as he walked, his gold wristwatch glittering in the daylight. He greeted his guests with a smile, but it wasn't a sincere one. He never quite reached his eyes. Behind him, a few of his men were standing with grudging and hard expressions. Tunde was confident. To him, this was only a formality. She was untouchable, and CJ a desperate boy trying to save himself. The inspector stepped forward and addressed the crowd. He told them the purpose of the gathering was to lay bare any allegations against CJ and seek the truth about the theft. And he maintained his cool yet assertive tone. The microphone was handed over to CJ. CJ stood up, shaking while he walked to the center of the hall. It felt massive. His voice quaked at the start, but he willed it out. His life turned upside down as he looked after his siblings, he told them. Inside the office of an agent of Tunde, he demanded power and served as their only source of sustenance. Then he turned to Tunde. "I swear to you, I didn't steal from you," said CJ, finding more strength through the process. "I never stole in my entire life. But I believe you already know this."